I was watching TV the other day, and this show comes on with these religious fanatics. I was watching TV the other day, and this show comes on with these religious fanatics. They were crazy. Well, you would think they were crazy if you didn't understand their culture and their religion. See, that's just the thing. They were worshipers of idols, and they took things to extremes. They painted their bodies. They wore these ridiculous costumes. They chanted, they danced, they made sacrifices to their idols. They had built these enormous temples to worship their idols in. It seemed like their entire existence climaxed into this one scenario, this one over-the-top act of worship. You don't really relate, do you? Let's try it again. I was watching TV the other day, and this show comes on with these religious fanatics. They were crazy. See, that's just the thing. They were worshipers of idols, and they took things to extremes. They painted their bodies. They wore these ridiculous costumes. They chanted, they danced, they made sacrifices to their idols. They had built these enormous temples to worship their idols in. It seemed like their entire existence climaxed into this one scenario, this one over-the-top act of worship. Idol worship. It's not just about golden calves anymore.
Welcome to TORAH Talk. I am your host, wil'Liam Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingston, Texas, USA, with episode number 17 of Controversial Issues with Rabbi Chaim Coffman from the Holy Land. Welcome, Rabbi Chaim Coffman, back to the studio again.
After which they sit down and passively listen to someone talk.
Oh, that's really funny.
Well,
Hey, hang on a second.
This
video is still playing in the background. How crazy is that? That's cool. Well, that's a good thing we have our music playing too, so time to bump it down.
I hear that.
Well, welcome, Rabbi. So good to have you back, for sure. People are confused right now, saying, are you back in the studio again? And I'm like, well, technically, yes, we green screened it again. So that's pretty cool. Pretty much do anything.
It's only because I threw you out after last week, so.
Hey, you know what? That's okay.
Good to go.
Let me look at the YouTube channel real fast, just to make sure that everything is actually as it should be. And because if I don't, sometimes it will go 5 or 10 minutes and I realize people are saying, I can't hear you. It's not. Pardon me. All right, my channel.
Why are those Indians still up there?
Okay, so tell us a little bit about this video. This video, for me, the first time I saw it, I was dumbfounded. I just honestly I did not know what to think, because when you put that type of a spin on it, it really kind of changes things, and it's just interesting. It really is. So anyway, so tell us a little bit about it. Tell us, introduce our evening. It's going to be with the television entertainment, right, and movies or whatever, Hollywood, whatever.
Right. So I will say, as a disclaimer, that you're listening to someone who was definitely a movie fanatic, or let's say sports fanatic. So I wrote a paper when I was in college an English comp that the paper was on how watching sports on television had hindered my true potential, to be a good student. So I mentioned, in this paper how, you have the pregame show, you have the game, you have halftime, you have all the highlights, you got the rest of the game, you start early, say 12 o'clock, 12:30, then you got the 4 o'clock game, then you got the later games, and then you have all the highlights, later at night. So you're talking about hours and hours, of time that is spent, well, back then was in front of the TV. So a lot of people still watch it, live on TV. Got, people watching all kinds of devices, etc. But, we'll see, a few statistics about just scary statistics about, how much time, people spend, and watch. So the real, by the video itself is actually, it's actually kind of funny comparing sports, to idolatry. Let's keep in mind, idolatry is one of the 3 cardinal sins every Jew has to give up their life for anytime, any place. The other 2 are murder and immorality. So idolatry is pretty severe. So idolatry doesn't necessarily mean that I'm bowing down, to something, right? I mean, that's normally the general, definition. I'm bowing down and giving something a power, that it doesn't have. So, the famous story with Abraham that the Medrash says that his father Terach sold idols, and Terach was out. So Avram took a stick and destroyed all the idols and put the stick, in the hand of one idol. So Terach comes back and he says, Abe, what happened? So Avram says, there's this big fight, all these idols fighting against each other, and this idol, was the last one standing. So Terach said, Abe, I don't understand. These idols don't have any power. They can't do anything. So Avram says, so then why do you sell them? Mm-hmm. Why do you worship them? It's like, oh, smart aleck kid, we're going to take you to King Nimrod, and let's see what Nimrod's going to do, right? Throws them in a pit, throws them in a fiery furnace, and, we all know, that story that he comes out unscathed. So idolatry doesn't necessarily have to be something that someone bows down to per se. It can be anything that a person gives power to, even though it doesn't have power, and takes God out of the world. Now, using that definition, anything in this world that is a distraction, in theory, again, I don't want anyone to say, oh, you said anything that takes God out of the world. Okay, what about using my phone? That takes God out of the world, right? But you have to communicate with people. So, and anything that you're going to, give power to, that's gonna, distract you, take God out of the world. Well, sports, entertainment, all these things, that's what it does. We'll get into the, the other issues about what I learned from it, and about, different things that, may not be good for my, for my psyche, so to speak, and how people get so involved in it. But, if you see, as we just saw, this video, people are crazed. I mean, it's you take for example, football, and how many people watch football in general. Imagine a playoff game. There was a game years ago. It was a game years ago in Green Bay. No offense to anyone, out in Green Bay or likes the Packers. The famous Ice Bowl. It's like, it's like 20 below, and, there's ice, snow, whatever. And don't think that, in this championship game, there was nobody there. I mean, the place is totally packed. People yelling and screaming, for their team, etc. I mean, that's kind of insane if you think about it. It's 40 below, whatever. So, the whole question, we're going to deal with is really what's the issue? If I'm just sitting there, watching, I'm not hurting anybody, I'm not, doing anything wrong. Is that really an issue that, I have to worry about? Or, there's, you're going to say, well, can't do this, can't do that. Like, everything is forbidden. So, what can I do that's fun, right? We spoke,
sure.
We mentioned last week this idea about, about circuses and going, going to amusement parks, really, about amusement parks, in different, in different things. and bungee jumping and whatever. So that the question, the question which we're gonna hit, and we sort of delved into it last week, is what's really the issue? Is there really anything anything wrong with it? And tell the truth that if you didn't have these sporting events going on the weekends, imagine what people would be doing. They'd have nothing. You wouldn't be filling a stadium of 50,000 people. Whether it's basketball, hockey, or football season, or whatever the case is, you're keeping people basically off the streets in a certain way. And you're keeping people, you're keeping them busy. Now, if they wouldn't be busy watching that, and and all these, professional, most of the professional sports, they're not losing money. Maybe hockey to a certain extent, but the other major ones, baseball, football, basketball, I mean, they're raking it in when it comes to comes to ratings, comes to it comes to other things. I mean, you take football for example, and all the violence and everything else, and how they've shown that so many ex-football players committing suicide because of all the all the hits to the head and all that. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit. And the NFL having to come out and having this wellness program and everything else. People don't care. The people watching it, they want to see, people go flying around. They want to see people get crushed. That's what they're living for. So it's it's really not that much different than what went on, 2,000 years ago by watching the gladiators. It doesn't, it's not such a, it's not such a big step, because people are going to say, oh, we didn't have that, didn't have that 3,000 years ago. Well, yes, they did. What do you think the Parthenon was? Go back to ancient Greece. You had, animal fights, against, they took slaves and had them fight against animals. I mean, modern, earlier day roller derby, different, different things like that. So this is not a, this is not a new, a new concept by any stretch. But what you have now is such an unbelievable thing, that you can watch numerous things at the same time. You don't have to you don't have to just watch one game. And even if you're watching one game on TV, they'll go to another game, show you highlights, this, that. You listen on the radio, other I don't know if people still listen on the radio, but whatever, other things as well. So like it's total saturation, and people can't get enough. Even if there are times there are strikes, like God forbid, like there's a baseball strike, or whatever the case is, and they have part of a season, half a season, whatever it is. You think less people come? People still gonna come. People still gonna come. It doesn't matter. So it is definitely providing a purpose. Certainly for that. On an entertainment level. Right. So on an entertainment level, no one's going to say that. I mean, unless you're not a sports fan, right? No one's going to say, oh, it's so boring. It's this. I never watch it. I mean, it is definitely, exciting. What goes on, especially, you watch the end of the game or the last few minutes, or, whatever. But, at the end of the day, as we mentioned the last few weeks, at the end of the day, we have to ask, if I'm watching these guys kill each other, right, and go after each other, and try and show how good they are, etc. Your soul is watching this as well. It's not like I can compartmentalize and I can say, well, I'm enjoying what they do, but I don't have to go in their way, right? I don't have to be like them, because if we knew what most of these athletes do when they're not on the field, then I don't think, why would anyone watch them, in the first place? If, he's an alcoholic, he abuses his wife, he does all,
right. Most people don't care. They just, most don't care. They just want them to perform.
Right. That is definitely, the issue. And, it's unfortunate, but people say, what do I care what he does? Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what he does. I want to see, how he plays. And, I remember a great rabbi once told me many years ago that, that it was a baseball, football fan, a little bit of a football fan, and met one of the all-time great football players. After he heard him speak, that was it. He just couldn't fathom, like, why are you gonna idolize somebody, or whatever the case is, when you hear how this person talks, and what he does and how he acts. You're gonna say, that this is good for my neshama, this is good for my this is good for my soul. That that's one aspect. That's one aspect of it. If you look at the fact that even if a person doesn't go, even if a person doesn't go to these to these live events, but they watch them, right? So we'll look at a little bit of statistics here. Just by football, they say 6 out of 10 people, 60% of people spend at least 5 hours or less, right? 5 hours or less during the week. Okay, that's not so bad. But you have, let's say 7% who watch between 11 and 15 hours a week. Now, if you break that down, it's a little bit scary, because how many hours a week, are there in the first place, right? If you're talking about 160 hours, during the week, and 15, so that's 10%. That's 10% of your week that you're just watching football. Forget anything else, right? Forget anything else. So, you have to sleep 8 hours, right? 7, 8 hours, hopefully people get enough sleep, or, in theory, and then you have to eat, and, you do other things, you want to spend time with your family, whatever, but you're spending huge chunks of time, sitting either, in front of a tablet, in front of a TV, in front of, whatever this device is. So there was a study done that of 168 hours a week, we spend more than 50 with whatever type of device, right? With whatever type of device that a person's on, be it a tablet, a computer, TV. 50 out of 168, that's a third of the time, right? And that, so you say, okay, a person's on that amount of time. A person could be chatting with someone. It could be business. It could be all kinds of things as well. That is, that is true. But according to these statistics, this is the breakdown of watching media devices for fun. This isn't business related. So if it's not business related, and you're talking 50 hours a week, I mean, that is an insane amount of time. That, first of all, people have way too much free time on their hands if that's what, if that's what they're doing. But if the whole purpose, God creates the world, and he puts us in this world, in order to connect to him, he's going to say, 50 hours a week? You guys are putting 50 hours a week that take you away from me, that take you away from serving me properly?
Right.
Right? So that, that's the question. Okay, if I want some downtime, what am I allowed to do? Right? But 50, that's an insane amount of time. I mean, if you want to see about, for instance, about movies, for instance, even though it seems that, over the last few years, people seeming to watch, it's a little bit down from what people, have watched in previous years. So, according to most recent statistics, you're talking about people watching at least 5 hours and 4 minutes, of TV a day. Now, they're only 24 hours, in a day. So if they're only 24 hours in a day, you sleep, let's say 7 hours, right? So now you're left with 21 hours. Now, during that time, you eat, a person works, for instance, so let's say it's another, 7, 8 hours, you get 15. So the rest of the time, almost the rest of the time, you do the math, this is what people are doing. Now people say, well, I'm not really watching, it's just background noise. And, then people will say, there are educational things on. So, cable came many years ago. People say there are many educational things, on that I could watch. I could watch the History Channel. right? So how many out there watch the History Channel? Raise your hand, right? Come on.
Right.
We're not living in Victorian England anymore. So somebody, I did a study with students at Hebrew at Hebrew University, and asked this question. You have a TV? Yes. You have cable? Yes. All right. How much you watch? What do you do? Etc. So there were a number of people said, there are terrible things that are on. Most things are not worth watching. So then why do you have a TV? If most things are probably not worth watching, forget bad language, forget learning bad things, how people speak against each other and do things and whatever, they maybe, I should get rid of it. I should take this thing and throw it out. How many people do that? And not only that, but even if there are educational things on there, right? I'm not going to say there aren't. Let's say that there are. I'd love to see. I didn't check this out. How many tens of millions, of Americans are watching the History Channel if it still exists. You want to tell me it's 80%? You want to tell me it's like less than half of 1%?
Right.
A quarter of a percent?
Let's do this real fast.
I don't think it's that high.
Okay,
Yeah.
there was an interesting question. It's a great question, actually. And so basically, is it okay to pray for a football team or a baseball team or something like that to win? Now you mentioned something earlier, which I think would be great to tie in with it. Is it okay to pray for the football team to drive it all the way down the field to the end zone? Is it okay to pray for Hashem to drive all the mice out of your house out into the out zone? I know
all women will be happy with that, that's for sure.
Hey, I just got to tell you, this isn't going to change my sports watching. Of course, I'm not much into football. I used to be, but I don't know. I would like to know what the halacha is for Judaism. That's the key.
So, the question being that, should a person pray for that? We can pray for all kinds of things, right? You pray for people that are sick. We pray for livelihood, even, in the Shemona Esrei, for Jews, the silent meditation, the first thing we pray for is that God should give us knowledge. Now, that sounds a little bit strange. Why should we pray for knowledge? Like, if I don't pray for knowledge, that means, I'm an idiot, even if I have an IQ over 200. So the knowledge that we pray for is that God should give us the ability to tap into his world, right? He should, help us be focused on what we need to do. Now, that really should be obvious. That really shouldn't be something that we should have to pray for. But at the end of the day, we live in this physical world. This physical world is a world of distraction. And since it's a world of distraction, we have to be focused. And, if we're not focused, or, if there are days we just say, I'm too tired, I can't learn, it's too, my brain is fried, or whatever the case is, as the Talmud brings down, or other places bring down, that if a person doesn't learn one day, it takes them 2 days to catch up. Doesn't matter, if you only learn, 20 minutes a day, half an hour a day, the fact that you're not strengthening your spirituality, so it's going down, right? It always needs to be, strengthened. So that being said, and we pray for all these different things, for redemption. Hey, this could be redemption of your team. Maybe it's not redemption of the world. Maybe it's not about bringing back the Messiah. It's like, come on, you got to get, you got a minute and a half to go. You're down by 10. You got to get, you got to get there. And then you got to get the ball back. And, people play like all these different, scenarios. I'll answer that. So that's by way of introduction. I'll answer the question the following way. Imagine when a person prays, right? If a person's, let's say we mentioned before by the Shemona Esrei, you're standing there, you have these 19 paragraphs that you're saying, and you're asking God for help in all these different things. Now, a lot of physical things, spiritual things, Jewish national things, whatever they may be. So if you're standing in front of God now, this is what we should be doing when we're doing it. You're standing in front of God and you're speaking to him. So you say, I need this, I need that, I need the other thing. We can have intention during these paragraphs, what I should, have in mind in all that. Now imagine you're standing in front of God and saying, it's third and long. It's third and 20. There's 35 seconds to go. We're down by 2. Got to get in field goal range. God, can you take care of this? Now, all right, so I'm sort of making a joke here, but, if this is what we're really supposed to be doing, and that is supposed to be my intention, when I pray, I'm standing in front of the King of Kings. He's the one who created the world. He's the one who took the Jews out of Egypt. He's the one who made all the miracles in Egypt, gave them manna, gave them man in the desert, right? Gave them all the mitzvahs. You're praying in front of the God that created everything, that keeps nature intact. So now let me ask the $1 million question. You're standing in front of God. Should I be praying for my team to score? And then they're going to win. So say, Rabbi, that's not fair. You're asking a question within a question. Well, that's what we do. That we're very good at that. We just sort of, deflect. But that is, if my goal is, to be close to God at the highest level, why should I, why isn't that necessarily idolatry? I am not bowing down. I'm not bowing down. I just want him, to let my team win. So, let's keep in mind, this basic idea. And, I heard a great rabbi say many years ago, and that is, let's say, your team wins or they lose. Doesn't matter whether they win, whether they lose. Does it or should it affect you in any way? Right? That is really, I think, the $1 million question. Whether they win, whether they lose, doesn't matter how they win, how they lose. Why should that affect my psyche? I'm going to have a good day because they won. You're walking on thin air. All you Cubs fans, 87 years, I understand. I feel the pain. I grew up in Boston, so no one ever thought, the Red Sox would ever win anything. My father, of blessed memory, said, I never thought, I'd ever see him win it, and they won it 3 times in his lifetime. That's I'm not saying it's necessarily a small thing, but at the end of the day, why should that matter? But people will tell you, of course it matters. You look at the millions that the stadiums are making, the franchises are making. I guess, if you live in a, in a big time, place, that is not, I'll go on record here. I can't imagine, God is sitting there saying, wow, look at my creation. This is such a tremendous thing. They're such avid fans. They're even going to pray to me to let their team win. Okay, that's a little bit cynical. And that could be that could be why people sit there and watch. They want to see what's gonna come out next.
The thought that's coming across my mind right now is it okay to pray for your team to win? If you've ever seen Bruce Almighty, you would probably understand that the answer to that would be no. If that movie was correct, because if he answers yes to me praying for the Cowboys to win the Super Bowl or whatever the case may be, but there's 10 million other people praying differently, or 5 million other people praying differently, or maybe it's half and half. It's kind of like answer yes to all. There's so many variables at play. It's not like praying for yourself and praying for a situation. This is on a much larger scale.
Yeah, but this is what's the difference. You're praying for a situation. You're praying that your team wins. That your team's going to win.
Yes, but if you do that,
the other guy's praying against you that his team should win, right?
Right.
So it's going in different directions, but the thing is,
So who's God going to listen to? That's the question. If you got 10 million people praying for this game to go one way or the other, who's he going to pick? If he answers the prayer, if he answers it all, or is he just going to let it alone and say, hey, chaos happens?
It's never going to end in a tie, right? Except in hockey, but the playoffs not going to end. It's not going to end in a tie.
Sure.
Right. So obviously there is going to be sway one way or the other. I mean, there could be a tremendous amount of things that go into it. Why this team should win or shouldn't win, and then it's going to have repercussions, years later. Obviously, that's only something, that God could know in the future. But, at the end of the day, it's kind of like, okay, it's going like this.
Yeah, right.
They're not going. Okay, you might say they're going head on, but somebody is eventually, is going to get.
Okay, so here's my follow-up.
So
here's my follow-up thought with that. Is it permissible to pray for this? And my answer as a father would be, sure, go right ahead. It's like my son says, hey, Dad, can we paint my room like right now? And I'm like, I'm not even home, and he calls me on the phone. Can we paint my room right now? But you have to paint it. I'm like, oh, sure, go right ahead. Yeah, it's like you can pray all you want. You can ask. Is it okay to ask me? Yes, it is. Is it okay for me? Do I have to say yes every time? No, I'm not going to say yes all the time. Dad, is it okay for me to ask you tomorrow if I can borrow your truck? I said, sure, go ahead and ask. Sure, go ahead. Not a problem.
So let me answer it like this. There's in the middle of the Shemona Esrei, in the silent meditation, there's a paragraph there for praying for someone who's sick. Right? So you mention the name, whether it's whether it's for a man, whether it's for a woman, right? That they should get better, right? We're talking about we're not talking about they have a hangnail, right? We're talking about something, pretty significant, that they are, that they are sick, and we want them to get better. You want to say that praying for something like that and praying for your team to score is on the same level? I mean, some people say yes.
Wow, really? That's crazy.
Some diehard fans like to paint their face. I was gonna,
like
I was gonna do that, but I didn't want to. I think there'd be other repercussions if I, green and white, like like the Celtics and the Shamrock, or like red and white for the for the Red Sox, whatever. Though I don't want to go down that path. If I put on my Patriots uniform, then everyone would be, wouldn't be anyone listening except for you and me. So, at the end of the day, that's what we have to think about.
Yeah.
And you cannot compare. I mean, again, people will say there should be no difference.
Yeah.
But keep in mind what you're saying. Again, if the idea is, am I drawing myself closer to God? I'm not even talking about what they do and how they play and cheating and all that. And what they do in their off time. Am I getting myself closer or not? I mean, it's a silly, it's a silly idea. I'm not saying, oh, whoever said that's an idiot. I'm not saying, in that sense. But how can you compare, someone's praying for livelihood when they're down, and they're having difficulty, or someone who's sick, or even something like the redemption of the Jewish people and bringing the Messiah, right? That's a pretty significant thing. We're in the Messianic age right now, right? There's only a matter of time before he comes. So that being said, you want to tell me that's on the same level as praying for your team to win? So again, a diehard person will say, I don't believe in this or that, or whatever. This is my God, right? That pigskin is my God.
Rabbi, I want to derail you. Yeah. Again, I have to do it from time to time. Complete derailment, off topic of tonight, but on topic with kind of what we're talking about right now. Robin McAdams on YouTube says, is it okay to pray to God and ask him if Jesus is the Messiah? Now, she's very serious. This is a very serious question. She's been following the past couple weeks, and she is a Christian, or maybe a Messianic, I'm not sure. But probably a Christian if she uses the term Jesus. But she's a friend of hers referred her to Tanakh Talk a few weeks ago, and she's been returning. So, how would you answer that? Is it okay to pray to God and ask him if Jesus is Messiah?
If someone, wants to see the truth, someone is interested in seeing the truth, right? Everyone, has a spark inside them, whether it's the same spiritual makeup or not in the soul, it doesn't matter. But everyone has that spark because everyone's created in God's image. So if everyone's created in God's image and somebody wants to search for truth, and I assume that the question is that I want to know, is this true or it's not? I want to be shown, right? Then all of a sudden, they're put in contact with somebody, say, You gotta watch this show. You gotta see this crazy guy gets up in the middle of the night, yells and screams and this and that. Like, we want absolute truth. Well, I don't know. You know, either you're coming to be entertained, or
funny.
you're coming to see like what in the world's gonna come out of his mouth. But if someone all of a sudden got information, they came on to I know a number of non-Jews who did a search, on YouTube, or on Google, and all of a sudden, some rabbi popped up. They said, "Oh, this is interesting. I'll take a look at this," and all of a sudden, it changed their whole, focus. And
Sure.
I say, "Wow, that could have happened by accident." Yeah, it could have. It certainly could have. But at the same time, if someone has that yearning inside, right? So they're looking for truth. So if someone is really looking for truth, and they say, "Listen, I want to know if this is true. Is JC the Messiah? Is he really true? Is it all true?" So then God can say, this person's really searching.
Mm-hmm.
Could be their soul was on Mount Sinai. They were really Jewish before. They got messed up along the way, through intermarriage and other things. So through that, now they're a non-Jew. They got caught up in, Christianity or, whatever. But they have that spark of the soul that wants truth.
Sure.
And somehow that spark is going to be, lit. And now, if they're so interested, I'm going to put them in contact with someone who's going to put them in contact, with getting the right information. Then all of a sudden, someone will say, "Oh, I saw Rabbi Singer, I saw his whole thing, changed my whole life," right? A lot of people I deal with, have seen his stuff, etc. So, and that's how they got, past, and moved on. That is not a coincidence either. If a person is really seriously searching, all a person has to do is have the desire, and God's going to open it up. Now, somebody could say, but you could have people like that, and they're thrown in a totally different direction, right? They could be given bad information. They could be, people with face paint and all that, and running around with stuff coming out of their nose, or who knows what. They could get caught up in the wrong thing. So why would God allow that? If someone's searching for truth, and they're really searching for truth, why put them on that path? So
Sure.
Talmud says clear, someone who wants to become pure, someone who's interested in the right thing, I'm going to help them 100%.
Right.
I'm going to bring them down a certain path.
Right.
If you want the dark side, you want the other side, I'm not going to stop him, because we have free will. You want to stick stuff up your nose and do all kinds of other things and be involved in, Wicca, turn people into frogs and bring up souls and, do all these different things. God says, okay, I'm not in favor of it, but I'm not going to stop you. If the search is true and it's pure, it's coming from the right place,
Right.
then you're going to be put in the right direction, and God's going to help you. In my own search, I hit different blocks along the way. I get to a certain point, I say, this is absolute truth. And I said, no, it's not. Then I went further. I said, this is it. And, changed my life in a different way. I said, this is perfect. I finally hit it. And I said, but it doesn't work. You can't pass it down to the next generation. A mule is a tremendously strong animal. There's only one problem. It's sterile, kind of like the Browns, right? It's
Right.
sterile. So, it doesn't work. So then, I went to the other side and I said, and this is where I've been for the last 25 years. So if you want to be helped, there are going to be, true, genuine people, or as I'll call them, the absolute real deal, that will help you to get to where you need to go to. There are a lot of fakers out there. There's a lot of fraud out there. That's definitely true.
Okay.
But someone who's really searching, they are going to get the help that they need, and they're going to get on the path that they need to go.
Nicely said. Yeah, I like your answer better than the one I was thinking of. Because, realistically, one thing that I had to come to terms with, and of course that was in my stage that I was in, was, he already told us whether he was a Messiah or not, just simply by looking at the Hebrew text. But some people need to hear. They need some clarification or some outside help, and I get that, which is kind of what you're saying. And I really.
But most people are so brain dead. They're not taught the question.
Right.
Because they're not taught the question, they just say you just gotta have faith. Gotta have faith, right? You just gotta have faith. and once you have these questions, they don't go away, and that's why most people I deal with get thrown out of the church for that reason.
Right.
So if someone has real questions, there are real answers out there, but there's always a but, and that is a person has to have their mind open enough to be able to hear the information.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have your mind so open until your brains fall on the floor, but you have to be willing to look at information and realize that if it's true or what I'm doing now is untrue and it's proven to me, then what am I going to do with the information?
Right.
I had somebody that once told me, they said, listen, you can prove to me 99% that the Torah is true, but I still have my 1%. I still have my 1% that it's not true. Right? There's only a Jew could say this. Non-Jew would never say this. Right? So I said, you ever write a term paper? He said, yeah. So I was a history major, so I had to write term papers a lot. So I said, so how do you write a term paper? He said, you write a thesis, and then in the body of your thesis, you try and prove it. Right? You try and prove step by step, that thesis, and you make a conclusion. I said, great. I said, what would happen? You have your thesis, you have 10 points proving your thesis, and then as you're writing your conclusion, you say, well, I saw a little bit of, other evidence. I'm not really sure if everything I've proven is true, and then you conclude. Like, you leave it all up in doubt. So this person said, you can't do that. You're going to fail. I said, why? He said, because if you have all this information, now you're disproving some of it, you leave it as a doubt. You can't leave a thesis in doubt. You have to prove it to the end. I said, very good. So if you have 99% of information that proves that you're wrong, how can you tell me I still have free will? I have that 1%. Would you take $1 million and put it on that 1%? Of course you wouldn't do it.
Right. Absolutely.
But the person said, yeah, but I still have that 1%. I said, did you just hear anything I just said? You would never bet your life on it. For instance, person's in a room. There are 10 doors. Behind 9 doors, it's the worst death that you could ever imagine. And behind 1 door, you go into paradise. You going to take that chance? So some people with no brains say, yeah, I'd do it. What, are you an idiot? Of course you wouldn't do it. You're going to open the door and die, right? You go after the majority. 90% of the time, you're going to die. No one's going to say, I'll take my chances, unless you have nothing to live for. Sure, I'll do it. Boom, knife right in the head. Boom, guns, blazing away. No one's going to do that. Nobody. Right? But this person was steadfast. I still got my 1%. So what is he saying? He said, I don't care what truth you show me. I don't care if it's almost 100%. I can still choose not to do it. So that means that's called cognitive dissonance. That means I'm going to take this information. I don't care. That means you're not so open-minded as you think.
Right? Yeah.
So that is part of the problem is most people, they'll say, I'm open-minded, let's have a debate. Well, if I prove you wrong, you're going to change? No, I just want to have a debate. Okay, it's not, there's a great rabbi involved in the Tshuva movement, Rabbi Ori Zohar, that he was a famous actor in Israel, and famous on TV, the movies, and he used to go to the Western Wall, make fun of religious Jews, wearing black hats, like, hey, cowboy, it's like, so the rabbi there he came in contact with that, he said, if I could prove to you, that the Torah is true, what are you going to do? He's like, what? You're going to prove to me that it's true? Oh, this is going to be fun, right? I'm going to waste the floor with you. He says, all right, come on, let's see. Let's have a discussion. After that first discussion, this rabbi put so many doubts in his head, and showed him so many different things, about the Torah being true, that was it. That was the final thing. But this person, was caught by the throat, and he was intellectually honest, and he didn't believe for a second this rabbi had anything to offer. Right? That the Torah had anything to offer whatsoever. Nothing. He said, this is going to be fun. This guy got blown to bits.
Right.
He got blown to bits, and
That's funny.
and totally changed his life, and he's changed the life of, tens of thousands, of Israelis by, by speaking and doing outreach and, and all that. It's unbelievable, but most people are not that intellectually honest, especially, especially Jews, because they're just not interested. It's not something that has an effect. They don't think it has an effect on their lives. Like, wow, I got great books and great things. You want to read about it? It's like, nah, I'm not interested. I'll take fantasy. Fantasy's a lot more, fun. If you'd ask somebody, what would you rather do? Would you rather eat, chocolate, ice cream, all your favorite foods, or spend the Shabbos where you can't watch anything, can't tear toilet paper, can't do anything fun. You have to sit in your house in the dark. Well, of course they're gonna say no. What are you kidding? Yeah, take the chocolate, take the ice cream, take football. Like, of course they don't see beyond, what they see, and that is the effect. And this is exactly the effect, of media, and people in the media, in the cynicism, and the cynicism that's out there. Because, if a person listens to sports talk radio, for instance, it has nothing to do with God. It's all about, ability. It's all about, what people say against others. This gets into the whole thing, about is this a good thing for my soul or not? Because imagine a team, let's say, in baseball season. So let's say, you get a team that was doing good, is doing bad, and everyone questions what the manager does. From the, for everyone, in the media in that place, why did you leave this guy, why did you leave this pitcher in the seventh inning? He'd already have 110 pitches, should have left him in, and then look what happened. They end up losing the game. Like, everything's second guessing, right? Like what they say, the backseat quarterbacks, like, oh, if I would have been there, I would have done this, I would have done that. Everyone, hindsight's 20/20. But what are they doing? They're speaking badly against him. They're cursing. They're doing all these different things that is not good. It goes against everything that the Torah stands for, right? And if a person listens on a regular basis to this, you listen to announcers for, whatever, on the radio, whether on TV, everything, I shouldn't say everything, a lot of what they're hearing, is, it's forbidden talk. So forbidden talk, you're not allowed to listen, you're not allowed to believe. So you have these people like ripping apart the managers, like, no, the manager's a good guy. It's not really his fault. His players aren't playing the potential. We can come up with like any number of potential, reasons to defend him. But at the same time, what are you doing? Right? What you're doing is you're going to cause potentially either between you and others, or just by listening, you're going to start yelling at these, at these radio people. I mean, they don't have the greatest language, that's for sure. I'm not saying they're necessarily cursing per se, and you have to like keep pushing the, the button for F-bombs and whatever. But, you're listening, and this, this is what we call, listening to bad things, right? It's, it's bad language. It certainly doesn't, do anything, for me, spiritually, even though, it's no different in that sense in politics. You listen to people putting their different spin, on what's going on in the world. Everyone's speaking against everybody else. This one said this, or maybe he said it, maybe he didn't say it. What did he mean? And everyone's giving their interpretation. What does it do? It kills people. That it just kills, it's defamation. That's what it is. I mean, they're not going to necessarily sue for it, but, it's defamation of character. And according to the Torah, no one says that is, that is permissible. So if you look at it in that sense, so not only am I wasting my time, I'm not doing what I should be doing, spiritually, but at the same time I'm learning different things that are, that are bad. I mean, let's say, for example, you have, 1980s or 90s, you had in baseball, you had this whole steroid issue, and this whole controversy, or controversy, depending where you're from. The whole controversy, should we let these people in the Hall of Fame, right? Every year in the Hall of Fame, when it comes to Hall of Fame ballots, should we let these people who definitely tested positive for, definitely took steroids, should we let them in or not? Well, that's an unfair advantage, right? They definitely have an unfair advantage. So what you said is 100% true. You don't care about that. You want to see him, crush a home run. You want to see this guy put someone else into the ground, right? That doesn't matter. But essentially what we're saying is, and this is what this whole philosophical discussion gets on, and that is, is that, is that permissible or not? You're giving someone an unfair advantage. That's cheating. Well, is if you're watching a game and a lot of the people are juiced up, etc., and even if they don't get detected, so basically what you're saying is, okay, so I don't care what they do, cheating is okay. Whoever, cheats the most and has the best players doing it, so they'll end up winning. And it gives certainly gives a bad taste, that's for sure. But again, if you would ask most people this question, they're going to tell you that, I saw this crazy rabbi in Tanakh. Like, nah, nobody cares. Nobody cares. But see, as a Jew, or even as a non-Jew, right, who doesn't want to convert, there's no such thing as compartmentalization. I can't say, well, I'm just watching what what this guy does and how he hits the ball or how he runs, with a football or catches or throws it or whatever. I don't care what he does in his private life. Really? You don't care what he does in his private life. That, these are not people that we should be looking up to. Maybe some of them they are. The vast majority, I mentioned last week, I think, or a few weeks back, you take somebody, that I saw on the train, who fought Mike Tyson. This guy, just by looking at him, you wouldn't want to meet him in a dark alley or an alley that's lit up. It's just, you see what the guy says, what he speaks, whatever. You say, wow, I don't care. I just want to see him box. Who cares what he does? So within Judaism, you can't say that, right? Within Judaism, it's about how people act. It's about what they say. It's how they say it. The Talmud says clear that if a person wants to learn under a rabbi, that rabbi has to be similar to an angel. Doesn't mean he's perfect, right? But if you want to learn from him, he has to have good qualities. He has to have good character traits. The great rabbi once told me he was learning, under somebody, tremendous genius, tremendous Talmudic genius, but his character traits were off the charts, negatively. So he said after a while, it doesn't matter how brilliant the person is, but when, if you see how the person acts, you see what they do, why would you want to learn, why would you want to learn, from somebody like that? So that is, that is crucial. I'm not even talking about people that are frauds. People are frauds are, something totally different. But, you're talking about somebody that has bad character traits, and again, everybody has them. But, if some are like so tremendously egregious and they're so bad, what is the Torah worth? The whole point of Torah, the Torah is the book of instruction. It's supposed to change me, right? It's, so what I learn should have an effect, on me. So the question the Talmud asks is exactly, what we're speaking about. What about going to a stadium or any other form, the witchcraft, any other type of frivolity, or whatever it is. So is it, it's considered to be in the category of what we call Moshav Leitzi. Moshav Leitzi means like I'm sitting with people that are, what's a late? Someone who scoffs, someone who mocks, someone who's, someone who certainly doesn't take the Torah seriously. So on that, on such a person, so the verse tells us in Psalms chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, fortunate is the man who I did not sit with in the company of scoffers, but his desire is the Torah of Hashem. Right? So according to this, person who participates in these type of things brings a person to wasting their time when they should learn Torah. So now the question that's asked is basically, okay, what is it? What's the problem? Am I sitting with scoffers? People don't believe, people are cynical, etc. Or, is the problem I'm just, I'm wasting time, right? That's the question. Is it one prohibition? Is it two prohibitions? I mean, again, I'm not even speaking about you go to a stadium and, what the guy next to you is speaking about, what other people are, doing. Years ago, I had a friend, had the, season tickets to hockey. He said, what's the best part about watching a hockey game? Are the fights, right? That's, and
Right.
he said, in the stands, not in the game, right? So no, I'm just kidding. But, there are, people enjoy that. So obviously, we're not talking about this idea of, we're living back in Victorian England and everything's great and no one's, there's tremendous sportsmanship and there's no upmanship and, and all this. So, there is a question, over here, what exactly the prohibition is. But what seems to be is that, if we're going to say it's a problem of, sitting with scoffers, so to speak, and people don't, believe in God, etc. So being around these people for things like this is going to remove your thoughts of God from your mind. Now, shouldn't that be our focus on a daily basis? I know there's a great rabbi that when he would learn, he would have in front of him written out, Shvisi Hashem Kenegdi Talmid, right? That I should always be thinking about God always, right? So one of his students asked him, he says, you're one of the Torah giants of the generation. Why do you need this? Why do you need this written out in order that, while you're learning? So he said that I don't want to sit and learn, and I'm learning Talmud or I'm learning Chumash or, I'm learning 5 books of Moses, whatever it is. I never want to forget I'm learning Torah Hashem, right? I'm learning the Torah of God. I don't want to learn it like a student. I don't want to learn it like, I'm learning mathematics. So his Talmidim, his students are incredulous. They say, you one of the Torah giants. You're really worried about that? You were worried about the fact that you're going to forget God at that, in a split second. He says, I never, ever want to forget what I'm doing in this world. Right. And that is the purpose, that is the purpose of what we're, what we're doing. So one of the Torah giants of the last generation, Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, may his name be blessed, answered that, anyone who goes to these places certainly transgresses the prohibition, Moshe Vleitzim, of, sitting with people that scoff and certainly wasting time, not to mention the time, spent going there and coming back and, and all that. But he understood also that, sitting with people that don't have fear of God, certainly, right, is certainly an issue and certainly a strong issue, not to mention that it constitutes a total waste of time. So if you're talking about just by football, for example, right, we don't even get to movies and other things, but, if you have 7% of people, right, that's like, let's say 25 million people, that's a lot of people, right, even less, right, a little bit less, right, that are watching 11 to 15 hours. You only have 160 hours in a week. Right, that's a tremendous amount of wasted time. That means that the brain is just gonna, atrophy the more a person watches and the more they are a, couch potato. I saw a study once done that they said that, the more a person reads and uses intellectual stimulation, the less likely, it's not proven 100%, so I don't want to be misquoted here. And that is that the more a person has intellectual stimulation, the less likely they're going to fall prey to, dementia or Alzheimer's, right? So the more a person lets their brain atrophy, and we only maximize about 3% anyway. So imagine all the brain cells, forget about drugs and all that, that a person's killing. You're gonna be sit there and watching, and a person's gonna be rooting for their team, however much time, and you're just in a vegetative state, a total vegetative state, and. It doesn't matter for how much, if the average amount of time people watch, is over 5 hours, that is, spiritually speaking, that's going to kill you because it takes a lot less motivation to, it's going to take you a lot of motivation in order to do what you really need to do. So the more stuff that you put on your soul that's negative, it's kind of like you're going to need a snorkel in order to breathe. I'm not going to say it's impossible, to get out of it. But, I told people years ago, with the amount of time I spent watching, sports and movies and other things, I said, no offense to all the great rabbis of the last generation. If I would have focused my time doing what I needed to do, push them aside, I would have gone to the top. Okay, that's, maybe my ego speaking, but, imagine how much time, is, is wasted. We're not in this world for that long. So people will say, just let me enjoy life. I just want to enjoy life. Stop giving me mussar. Stop telling me about ethics and how I should change myself. But if you're in this life for a short amount of time, you don't want to get upstairs and say, didn't you listen to that TORAH Talk episode? Didn't you see how much time was wasted? Look at what your brain cells could have done. And then God's going to show you that second movie, what your potential was. Because I didn't have that potential. I said, yeah, because you're too busy watching football. You're too busy watching this other stuff, and it killed your brain cells. This is what happened. You don't want to hear that.
Right.
You don't want to hear that in the next world. Is this going to stop people from doing it? I'm not going to say it's going to stop people. The statistics are absolutely scary, of how much time is wasted. So people have free time during the week, 50 hours. A third of your time, people are watching on different media outlets. They're watching things for fun. Whether it's movies, whether it's sports, doesn't matter what it is. 50 hours a week. That's an insane amount of time. Right? So in the world of technology that we live in is tremendous things. But people 100 years ago didn't have time to waste. They were too busy, they were too busy taking care of the farm, getting food. People living in poverty. There were wars. All kinds of things. Now we have all this free time. We're killing ourselves spiritually with it. No one's putting a gun to our head. No one's saying, if you don't come to the stadium, we're going to kill you. Trust me. 50,000 people, playoff game, no problem to sell it out. Right? Absolutely no problem. We're doing it to ourselves. And, and that is, that's the scary part. So, going back to the original question, should I be able to pray, to be able to pray for my team to win? Think about what you're saying in that question.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider.
Just think about the legitimacy of that question. You can say, wow, why take it so seriously? It's always sports. I want to see my team win. But, break it down and analyze, what exactly you're saying. You are praying to God because you think God is out there, right? I'm not going to say that's a bad thing. You're praying, but you're praying for your team to win. It's not necessarily the same thing as a person praying to win the lottery, right? The famous joke that guy is praying to win the lottery. So the angel comes in front of God and says, God, just I'm sick of this guy. 3 times a day he's praying, let me win the lottery, let me win the lottery. Like, I'm sick of hearing this guy. So the angel says in front of God, let him win the lottery. So God says, of course I'd let him win the lottery. The guy never bought a ticket. If he would buy a ticket, I'd let him win the lottery.
That's like the 2 boats in a helicopter thing. Let the guy drown.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So that that's the whole thing. But when you compare letting my team win, and praying for a livelihood and health, and all that. So essentially, you're saying, I believe maybe. That there is a God out there, otherwise I wouldn't be praying, right? So if I do believe that, I just can't imagine what God's thinking.
Right.
It's like I created the world, I created the universe, I keep everything going, and you praying me for your football team? This is what man is. This is why I gave the Torah. This is why I created the world.
Down to, right? It's funny.
That is really, that's really the base.
Okay, now wait. Now I've got to throw, like I said, I've got to throw some counterbalance in there. Okay, so
of course.
As a father, I've got work to do. I've got the house is even when I'm off work, the house got to be clean, the yard's got to be mowed. There's so much to do that's important with maintaining our family and to keep peace in the home. So why would my son come to me and ask me, Dad, can we go to Dairy Queen? Why would he waste his time doing that when that's not important? So the argument would be this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so are you saying that God is so business oriented that he does not care about giving you something to entertain yourself with, Dairy Queen?
No, God,
a video game,
wants, I got it. The Ramchal, Rabbi Chaim Coffman, in his book Derech Hashem and the Path of the Just and the Way of God and the Path of the Just, says the whole purpose that God created the world is God wants to be a meitiv. The root of the word meitiv is to do good, right? He wants to give goodness to the world. But guess what? God says, you know how I give goodness to the world? Well, guess what? I manufactured a book. I wrote it myself. I passed it down to Moshe, my prophet. It's called the Torah. Right?
Yep.
So God says, if I manufactured it myself, this is what I want, and these are the parameters. Now, if a person wants to go out to eat, with his family, and it's going to draw his family closer, together, and they're going to have a good time and they're going to bond, nothing wrong with it. Want to go to Dairy Queen?
Right.
I grew up on Dairy Queen also. When I was a kid, there's nothing, you're bonding, you're having a good time. So, again, obviously, someone's going to eat, they're going to make a blessing, they're going to give thanks to what God's given them. So, that's also part of a religious experience, even though, you're in a restaurant, you're in an ice cream place, whatever. There's definitely a place, for that. But, there are checks and balances. There are definite, parameters. So then people say, well, I should be able to do that twice a week, 3 times a week. Now, even though that may be permissible, in this case, so you can't take it so far and say, okay, I'm going to open it up. I'm going to open this whole Pandora's, I'm going to open up this whole Pandora's box. That's not what God wants you to do, right? Even though, a person may be tired and can't focus and whatever, okay. If a person can't, their brain is fried, so, you can relax, in other ways, right? We spoke about, music or reading books or, other things. But again, it has to be within context. It has to be within boundaries. Should a person, if they want to relax, should they read, books that have filthy language in it? Well, that doesn't, that goes against what you're trying to do in a certain way. So it has to be within context that is going to be something that's going to be beneficial and is going to help, it's going to help my soul. I mean, some people will say, which I've been taking a task for, is eating hallucinogenic mushrooms is going to benefit my soul. I mean, you want to ask God on that topic? I mean, you want to alter your mind, and that's going to give you a, this tremendous experience, be closer to God. Well, that's open for discussion. That's open for discussion. These other things, again, person has, family time. Oh, you should be learning Torah. Don't spend time with the family. Well, what are your kids going to see? There is a place for learning Torah. There is a place for, bonding with your kids, bonding with your family. Oh, it's a waste of time. Yeah, it's a waste of time. Your kids won't have anything to do with you when they're, when they're older, right? So, you're allowed to take them out, go on nature walks, do other things, again, but it has to be within, a certain, within certain, within certain boundaries. You're going to say, oh, this rabbi said everything's forbidden. I didn't say everything's forbidden, but you have to, you also have to be smart. 614 commandments. Don't be stupid. You can't, take things way out of context and say, well, this one case I'm going to permit, and then I'm going to open up the whole, I'm going to open up the floodgates. You can't do that either. There has to be a balance, and we live in a, tremendously topsy-turvy world. So finding that balance is definitely not so easy, right? It's definitely not so easy. But I can tell you that the balance can go all the way to the other side when when a person has wasted, hundreds, thousands, millions of hours doing things that take them away from the service of God, and that is really what the point is.
Right. Very good. Well, I'll tell you what, in summary, if you want to just wrap us up, we'll go ahead and close out. Just as an overall, we've covered in the past 3 weeks, sex, drugs, rock and roll, TV, sports, and entertainment. So what would be your overall summary for message for the people out there? Not the Jew, but for the Noahide in general, based on everything you've said.
Right. So, for anybody out there, Jew or non-Jew, right? A non-Jew also wants to have a connection, right? They also want to have their own, their own connection to God. So, so for a non-Jew, this may not be a problem at all. Going to a stadium, watching something, etc. But keep in mind that, if they're getting negative, they're seeing negative things. They're hearing people speak badly and bad language and, all kinds of other things. Certainly with movies as well, etc. So that is not going to be beneficial, definitely, for them. Even if they say, well, I'm just sitting back, I'm not gonna learn from what these people say. I'm not gonna learn from what they do. I just want to be entertained, right? But being entertained comes with a price. Looking at billboards comes with a price. You may see things you don't want to see, but there are subtle messages. Some of them are pretty obvious. Right, a lot of them are pretty obvious, but there are subtle messages that a person, is going to get, that it, goes against, how they're going to serve God. That's why on the Super Bowl, commercials, are like $500,000 for like 30 seconds.
Right.
Something like that, because you get the most amount of people, watching it, but their messages are pretty simple. Oh, you're thirsty, it's halftime. Oh, let's go get a Coke. Oh yeah, get a Coke. What a great idea.
Yeah.
Go out and get some munchies, get this. That's definitely more, more subtle, but I can tell you from the little that I do know that these messages make a very, very strong imprint on the soul. And it's something that's very, very hard. Anything that's impure is very hard to get rid of, because as the verse says, it like sticks to you. It's like glue. To learn Torah is something that's hard. To be a spiritual person and work on themselves is a hard, it's definitely a hard thing. So even for the non-Jew to say, well, I could be a non-Jew and watch football at the same time. Yeah, you can. Just keep in mind, what you're doing, is it going to have, is it going to be positive or negative, on me. And, again, even for the non-Jew, even if everybody, speaks bad language, or a lot of people speak bad language, doesn't mean that they have to do that, but it's negative. So if it's negative, it's going to affect you.
Right. It's
going to affect you in a negative way. And, people will say, well, maybe the laws of Lashon Hara, speaking badly against others don't necessarily apply to me. That, that could be true as a non-Jew. But at the same time, if you speak against others, even though they're never going to know, it's not going to affect them and this and that, is that something that is, is that something that's positive? And for them, most people would say, well, if I do this, and even if everybody does it, so what if everybody does it, it still affects me in a negative way. And if it does, that takes me away from what I need to do.
Sure, that makes sense. I mean, so I guess you could say, and just to sum it all up, anything that you do that's worldly, that satisfies the flesh, even though it may not be forbidden, it technically does not push you towards Hashem, and I would say it clouds your receptors. It makes it to where you're not as sensitive to picking up things that are spiritual.
And it makes it that much harder.
Right.
To fight against it. I mean, a little bit of Torah pushes away a lot of darkness, but you're still going to get rid of the darkness. And, getting rid of the darkness is definitely a difficult thing, especially if it's ingrained, in you, and, and you've seen it for so long, etc. And the vast majority of people will think you're absolutely a whack job by even saying that. It's like, oh, what do you care? Who cares? I watch it, I get enjoy. I have a good time.
Yep.
I'll just give one example. Imagine the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl is like a whole day. People like plan their day, what's going to be.
Sure. Right.
It's a whole day, and you have 250 million people watching this game. Right, so and everything goes in. What are you going to serve? Who's going to come over? What are you going to do? And most times the game's not even worth watching anyway. But even so, a whole day, that is entrenched, in this one thing. Imagine 27 hours. A person is fasting and working on themselves on Yom Kippur. 27 hours, right? You're working, you're striving, all these different things, and you spend 12. 1/2 a day or whatever, 6 hours, 8 hours, whatever it is, you spent a good chunk of a day preparing for this event.
Right.
I mean, it's a scary, it's a scary thought, because didn't you watch the Super Bowl? Yeah, I went to one also, but it doesn't mean it's a it's a good thing that something that we should definitely want to strive for. And I'll end with this. And at the end of the day, this great rabbi said, why in the world should I care my sports team does good or bad? Why should that affect my life in any way? And the reality is, it shouldn't. Who cares? They play good, they don't play good, they cheat, they don't. It should have no effect whatsoever. But that just means that we live in a society that we're surrounded by that that is important, that does have a tremendous amount of importance. And the message is very subtle, that this is what I should be doing. This is what I should be thinking about. And of course it's important. Didn't Rashi, what did Rashi say in last week's Torah portion? Wasn't he shortstop for the Yankees? Come on. Isn't that what he did? Isn't that what he,
That's
who
funny.
was he anyway? We get lost. We get lost in it because I guarantee you most people will say that, after going through all this, it's like, wow, it's a very interesting, different perspective. You give this perspective over to others that, are really into sports or movies or whatever. And, I'm talking about people who aren't, and they're going to think you're absolutely out of your mind. They're like, don't worry about it. It's all fine. You don't go, I'll go. Or I'll watch. Or I get 50 other thousand people. I get millions.
Right.
Millions of people, that are going to back me and not back you yet because these people are brain dead and this is what they want. It's fulfilling a desire to the least common denominator.
Right. That's
and if that's what it does, it's 100% negative.
Right. Very true.
Because then you're going to lose all these people. They're going to disappear because they don't care. They're apathetic of all the media and everything that have to be thrown at them. It's probably a good topic also, what the media does and how we're affected by it, for sure.
I'll tell you what, it's definitely been a controversial issue tonight. Thank you for spending the time and really explaining it very thoroughly. I mean, I picked up a few things from you tonight that I hadn't heard before as well, and definitely much to think about. So, Rabbi, thank you again, and we'll see you next week, same time, same place. And y'all, hey, all of you guys who watched live tonight, we only had about 5 of you guys that were actually logged on when we started. If you didn't see it from the very beginning, you'll want to go back in about a half an hour and start it over because you missed something pretty important. You'll love it. So, shalom to you guys. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Rabbi, love you, man. And take care.
All right.
Take care. We'll see you.
Shalom,
Everybody.
shalom.
Shalom. Take care.